So I want to look at the Pachuco phenomenon that happened in the 1940s. So earlier we talked about how Mexican Americans were acculturating to the United States, right? They were growing up. You had the reading that kind of addresses that point too, right? They're growing up in the United States and they're kind of living in two worlds, right? The United States and American culture, sorry, and Mexican culture. In the 1940s, you have this phenomenon called the Pachuco uh, Pachuco culture, right? Almost Pachuco movement that happens in places like Los Angeles and other parts of the world too. Now, much of this has to do because Mexican American youth were leaving the barrio, right? Their traditional, if you want to call it that, Mexican neighborhood, and going into the urban centers where there were African Americans and Anglo Americans, right? And they kind of mingled with them. So in the 1940s, you hear this word Pachuco emerge from the Mexican American community. Now, the word itself meant that somebody was from El Paso. But then eventually the word takes a life onto its own, where it signifies somebody who was an outsider. Now, this happens because Mexican American youth did not feel like they were part of American mainstream culture. A lot of it had to do with racism. And also because they were very different from their parents' culture, right? They were influenced by American culture, so a lot of times their parents were not happy that they were too, quote unquote, Americanized. And this created friction in the Mexican American growing up at this particular time in the 1940s. Add to that you have World War II, a time period where you felt like you had to pick a side, right? Or at least that's the way it was perceived, that you were either American or you were not, right? And if you were not American, it meant that you were against the United States. Again, this is all perception, it wasn't reality. But the Pachuco and Pachuca signified that. So the word itself eventually begins to reflect, again, an outsider, but also people begin to use it to define Mexican Americans, just in general, particularly the police and the press. So anytime they called somebody a Pachuco, Pachuca, it almost signified somebody who was Mexican American. They weren't necessarily dressed like a Pachuco, but that's where mainstream society made that connection. Now, just as American culture was not happy about the Pachuco, nor was Mexican culture. And there's a very famous writer, his name is Octavio Paz, who criticizes the Pachuco and Pachuca, in essence, right? And what he says, he wrote an essay called Pachucos and Other Extremes. And in this essay, he's very critical because he sees the Pachuco, the Mexican American, the Pachuca, almost like a bastard person in bastard culture, right? So in this essay, he identifies the Pachuco as a clown. Part of it has to do with the outfit. As you can see here in this picture, the outfit is kind of big. This is an African American. And for Octavio Paz, in this essay, he's actually trying to understand what does it mean to be Mexican, but in doing so, he uses the Pachuco or the Mexican American as the antithesis of this argument. So the outfit is very big, hence the association with a clown. He mocks them, basically saying they're neither Mexican nor American, and that the Pachuco rejects both culture and flaunts his difference, right? He does this by not only the clothing that he wears, but the way that he behaves. If you ever seen the old Mexican movies Cantinflas, you can associate the Pachuco with the mannerism of Cantinflas. He's very not flamboyant, but his mannerisms are very extreme. In addition, the Pachuca, they actually speak their own language. So they heavily borrow from American culture, from American language, from Mexican language, but they also create something new called Calo, C-A-L-O. And they have words that are still used today that only they understand. So think of it kind of like your generation and how you have certain terms to have a different meaning, right? So your parents will not understand. So it's the same idea. So he continues to say, Octavio Paz continues to say that the Mexican American does not want to assimilate. So again, Octavio Paz is very critical of the Mexican American. So it's not so much that Mexican Americans did not want to assimilate, it's that they were not allowed to, as you read in the article, right? They faced these barriers of American racism that limited their acceptance into the American mainstream. And then lastly, he says, the Mexican American has lost his tongue, his religion, his customs, his beliefs. All you have is left is a body and a soul. Uh, Basically arguing that this hybrid, right, this Mexican American um, entity exists, but really he has no meaning in this world. So he studied them for a few years, and by study I use that very loosely because he's more focused on the Mexican national identity than he is with the Mexican American. And a lot of people kind of associate the Pachuco as being a gangster. Lastly, he says his costume protects him and makes him vulnerable. So the Pachuco and Pachuca are able to create a subculture in Los Angeles, right? So the costume allows them to be part of this sub community, but at the same time, it makes them vulnerable because he and she are viewed as outsiders, right? They're not welcome into the mainstream. So there's that kind of conundrum, right? That Mexican Americans live in two worlds. A lot of times they say, ni de aquí ni de allá. I'm neither from here nor there. So I'm kind of living in these two worlds and I don't know exactly where I fit in. I try to fit into American culture. They rejected me. My parents feel like I am way far too assimilated, so they reject me. So you have this new thing called the Mexican American or the Pachuco. So I quickly want to show you some pictures. I actually interviewed a Pachuco back in the 1990s for an essay that I wrote. And this man was, God, he must have been already in his 80s, I think. And he was born in the 1920s. He was a bit of a troublemaker. So most of the women he met were a little bit like him. But that's more the anomaly than the reality. All right. So he describes them, his name is Ezekiel Oropesa. He describes them as, some of them wearing, at least many of them wearing dresses, particularly around the knee area, maybe above the knee, or at least, if not dresses, skirts. They had long hair. They would raise it up, which was the style at the time in the 1940s. A lot of women, not just Mexican American women, but women in general, had that big old kind of pompadour hair. And the women that he hung around with would stick knives in their hair, right? Because every so often they would help them out in case they got in trouble. And as he kind of describes in this example. Here, I'm going to talk about these women in a little while, but you get a visual representation of the skirts and dresses that go right above the knee. And again, for many Mexican families, this was not seen as a good thing because it denotes the sense of sexualized beings, even though that's very problematic. And some of these women were didn't engage in sexual activity, right? So, but again, that's what they wore because that was the style at the time. And there you see the hair, right? That kind of pompadour hair. He continues to describe them in situations where they protected him. He says, we went to 2 cars with 5 guys and 5 girls. We sat at the bar and right away a gang walked in. We knew there was going to be problems, so the girls stood up in front of the guys, and then we followed with me in the middle. The girls were just as tough as any guy that day and protected us. They would defend us whenever we were outnumbered. So again, the women that he hung out with, again, they're not troublemakers. They were just out at a bar having a good time. But if there was going to be a problem, they were there to protect them, right? Here you see a woman wearing the suit itself, which is not something that's too common, though you see it down here too, right? Just so you get that visual of what they're wearing. Now, the suit itself actually comes from jazz culture, right? The slide before had the African American image wearing the suit, And these Mexican American youth are going down to the clubs and dancing, so they're interacting with many different cultures, and they're picking up and borrowing different elements of what they're experiencing at that time. So everything from the fashion to the food, to the dance styles of the era, which again creates a lot of conflict when they would go back home and bring this to their parental culture. So I quickly want to address as the last slide the Pachuca specifically and the Sleepy Lagoon case. So as I mentioned earlier, for many Americans, they kind of presented the Mexican American girl as a Pachuca. So the word almost became synonymous with Mexican American, right? Here's a term that the press actually used, the Pachuca girl. So anybody that was Mexican American, the police or the press would use this term to define them. And in using these terms, they essentially stereotype them, right? We talked about stereotypes and the function of a stereotype. So this is a great example of how particularly the police would profile many of these Mexican American girls. There's an example of a young Mexican American girl who was walking home after she had gone to the store, and the police were harassing these zoot suitors. So she started complaining to the police, hey, leave them alone. So right away, they arrested her for being a Pachuca, even though she wasn't. But it didn't really matter. For them, she was viewed as a zoot suitor, right? A Pachuca girl. So the American press would call this the zoot suit girl or the Pachuca, would define them, sorry, as promiscuous, right? Always um, looking for sex, as delinquents, as we'll see with the Sleepy Lagoon case, as dangerous as Zico Oropesa, right, mentioned them with their knives up in their hair, as sharp looking with again the pompadour and the short skirts, and as prostitutes, because it challenged some of the maybe social etiquette or maybe even the fashion of that period. They were viewed as problems rather than just young women who are, young women. So here's a quote from the press. Many of these pachuquitas were little tornadoes of sexual stimuli, swishing and flouncing down the street. So this is the way the press typically represented these young Mexican American girls. And this comes from the American press, right? Over sexualized beings, which is not uncommon. In the 1930s, we have films of Mexican women who are often represented in the same light. So it's no coincidence that these stereotypes stick to them, right? Because in film, a decade before, Mexican American women are already viewed in this way. Lupe Velez is a great example of a woman who's represented in this over sexualized lens. Now, in the Mexican press, newspapers like La Opinión would define Mexican American girls as las Malinches. Malinche supposedly in the 16th century, she sleeps with Cortez and sells out the Aztec people to the Spanish. So she's viewed as a traitor. So the Mexican press view these Pachucas as a traitor, partly because they felt like these young Mexican American women were not conforming to the cultural traditions of their parents. So to them, it was presented as bringing shame to the Mexican people. Now understand and these are not absolutes, but typically when you're a person of color, you represent not just yourself, but everybody, right? Everybody from your family to your culture. And we hear this constantly, even today, where we go, oh, Mexican getting arrested, all these Mexicans do these crimes, blah, 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 right? Whereas Anglo-Americans, they have this concept of individualism. So a lot of times, we see the same thing with the Anglo-American. They're not, I guess, shamed to the same extent that people of color tend to be shamed. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen to them, but not to the extent that it happens to people of color, whether you're African American, Asian American, or Mexican American, right? Or other people of color, right? Now, when we look at these young women, again, we see that many of them are being constantly watched both by American society and by Mexican society. In this very famous case called the Sleepy Lagoon case, there is a murder of a young Pachuco named Jose Diaz by an unknown person. Now, the police did a sweep of Mexican American youth who they thought were guilty, and I think they arrested I think the first day they arrested like 600 people. It was a lot of people. And eventually 38, I think 30, no, it was 38th Street Gang. A number of them were arrested and actually put on trial and were put in prison. Now, out of this group, 10 of them were women that were swept during this run. And 16 of them were put in a juvie and spent about 16 months. And even after they were released, they became ward of the state. Now, why is this significant, right? Why is this case important? Well, it's the first time that the police really begin to target Mexican American women. So before the Sleepy Lagoon case, you don't really have too many arrests of young Mexican American women. After the Sleepy Lagoon case, which was in 1942, again in the middle of World War II, all of a sudden Mexican Americans were viewed as a problem, particularly women for this example here. So, who were these women? Well, what we find is that the majority of them were just young women who liked to dress in the fashion of the time. A lot of times they borrowed American culture that they saw on film, everything from the makeup to the clothing. And the majority of them, I think I saw one statistic that said only 0.06 of them were, violent, if you will, right? Again, 0.06 is nothing, right, compared to the majority of them. But because Mexican Americans are being stereotyped, being racialized, and being sexualized, they quickly become a target. For the police, they begin to blame Mexican families as not taking care of these young ladies, bringing them up correctly, even though many Mexican families felt like white girls were much more, I guess, moralists or right had more loose morals than their daughters. So it's kind of funny how Mexican American women are viewed as these troublemakers, yet Anglo American women are not. Now, understand that this is during the time of the war where you have things such as the Victory Girl, right? These young Anglo American women who would either dance for a couple cents, who would sleep with some of the service men, right? Some of the military men. Yet it's Latina women that are shamed only based on the color of their skin and the clothing that they were wearing, right? The fashion that they were wearing. So again, the case is very important because after 42, we really begin to see an attack of young Mexican American women, again, by the press and by the police, where they're seen as these kind of troublemakers. But at the end of the day, they're just youthful young girls who are like like any other generation of the era. All right. So I just want to touch on Mexican American Pachucas because it's such a interesting phenomenon. And I'll end it there. So again, you see this kind of culture clash happening with this generation in the from the 1920s to the 1940s. All right. So hopefully you enjoyed learning about Mexican American women, and we'll pick it up later and talk about women in the 40s during the war.